Right now, as you are watching this, a storm sitting hundreds of miles off the coast of Mexico has just done something the Eastern Pacific has not seen happen in 2 full years. Hurricane Genevieve strengthened into a Category 5 storm this morning, the 27th of July, after gaining 65 miles per hour in wind speed in a single 24-hour window, one of the fastest rates of intensification measured anywhere on the planet so far this year. At the exact same time, roughly 1,000 miles to the northwest, Hurricane Fausto is closing in on the Hawaiian Islands, expected to pass just north of Oahu and Kauai within the next 2 days, still strong enough to drive dangerous surf and rip currents onto every east-facing shore in the state, even as the storm itself weakens. And in a detail that tells you almost everything about how strange this hurricane season has become, the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean Sea, and the Gulf are sitting almost completely still. The National Hurricane states plainly that no tropical cyclone formation is expected anywhere in that entire basin over the next 7 days. This is the story of why one side of the world's hurricane basins has gone eerily quiet, while the other is producing the first major hurricane of the year, sourced directly from this morning's official advisories, not recycled headlines. Drop a comment and tell me if you are watching from Hawaii, Mexico, or anywhere along the Gulf Coast right now, because the situation genuinely depends on which coastline you're standing on. If you want grounded storm coverage instead of panic headlines, subscribe. It is free. And a like helps this reach the people who actually need to see this today. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Thank you. Now let us get into it. Genevieve's rise to Category 5 status did not happen slowly. The storm was still a tropical storm as recently as Saturday night, and by Sunday evening, it had already reached Category 4 strength with sustained winds of 140 miles per hour, a jump the National Hurricane Center in Miami confirmed as it tracked the system roughly 530 miles southwest of Manzanillo. Meteorologists watching the storm in real time attributed that explosive growth to a combination of very warm sea surface temperatures, unusually low wind shear, and strong upper-level divergence. The same 3 ingredients that show up again and again whenever a storm undergoes what forecasters call rapid intensification. By Monday morning, Genevieve's winds had climbed further still, reaching 160 miles per hour and officially crossing the threshold into Category 5, the highest classification on the Saffir-Simpson scale, making it the first Category 5 hurricane anywhere in the Eastern Pacific Basin in 2 years. Despite that extraordinary strength, the storm is not currently forecast to threaten land directly. Genevieve is tracking west-northwest, roughly parallel to the Mexican coastline rather than toward it, and forecasters expect the storm to eventually run into cooler water and a less favorable atmospheric environment that should force it to weaken again within the next several days. That does not mean the storm is harmless S from where it sits. The National Hurricane Center has already warned that swells generated by Genevieve are reaching the southwestern coast of Mexico and are expected to spread to the southern Baja California peninsula, producing what the agency specifically described as life-threatening surf and rip current conditions along exposed beaches, even without the storm itself ever making landfall. Fausto's story is almost a mirror image of Genevieve's, a storm that reached real strength early and has been fading ever since, but is still carrying enough energy to matter for the people directly in its path. The hurricane entered the Central Pacific Basin as a Category 1 storm and briefly strengthened to Category 2 as it continued its westward track, generating enough concern that Hawaii's own Central Pacific Hurricane Center in Honolulu began issuing regular public updates days before the storm's closest approach. The consistent theme across nearly every one of those updates has been a storm expected to weaken as it interacts with cooler water east of the islands and increasing wind shear, a well-known pattern for systems approaching Hawaii from the east, but one that still requires real preparation rather than assumption. As of this morning, Fausto sat several hundred miles east of Hilo with maximum sustained winds of 85 miles per hour, moving west at a steady 14 miles per hour. And the current forecast track keeps the center of the storm passing just north of the island chain overnight Tuesday into Wednesday as a weakening tropical storm. Forecasters have been careful to stress that even a small shift in that track could change the outcome for individual islands, since the difference between a storm passing safely to the north and one brushing the coastline directly often comes down to a matter of only a few dozen miles, the kind of margin that can look trivial on a 5-day forecast map and decisive on the actual day the storm arrives. The primary hazards residents have actually been asked to prepare for are not catastrophic wind damage, but elevated surf, dangerous rip currents, gusty winds, and the possibility of localized heavy rainfall in mountainous terrain. Exactly the kind of hazards a weakening tropical system typically produces, even when it never technically makes landfall. What makes this exact moment worth pausing on is not really either storm in isolation, it is the contrast between what is happening in the Pacific and what is not happening in the Atlantic at the same time. because both outcomes are being driven by the same underlying climate pattern. This year's Atlantic hurricane season has been unusually quiet by design rather than by accident. Multiple forecasting agencies, including NOAA and the team at Colorado State University, predicted a below-normal season for the Atlantic well before it even began, citing a developing El Niño event expected to strengthen through the peak months of the season. El Niño works against Atlantic hurricane formation in a fairly direct, well-understood way by increasing wind shear across the Caribbean and the tropical Atlantic, the same disruptive change in wind speed and direction with height that tends to tear a strengthening storm apart before it can organize. NOAA's own outlook placed the chance of a below-normal Atlantic season at 55%, more than 5 times higher than the 10% chance it assigned to an above-normal season. Colorado State University's forecasting team projected total Atlantic storm energy for the year at somewhere between 55 and 60% of the long-term average. That forecast has held up almost exactly as predicted. Through the end of July, the Atlantic has produced only a single named storm, well below the typical pace for this point in the season. And this morning's official outlook confirms there is nothing currently expected to change that over the coming week. El Niño does not suppress hurricane activity everywhere, though. And that is the other half of this story. The exact same warming pattern in the central and eastern tropical Pacific that raises wind shear over the Atlantic tends to do the opposite in the eastern and central Pacific basins, lowering wind shear and warming the ocean surface across a wide stretch of water that storms like Genevieve and Fausto are currently drawing energy from. Forecasters, covering both systems this week, noted explicitly that the eastern and central Pacific basins are expected to produce an above-average number of named storms, hurricanes, and major hurricanes this year, specifically because of El Niño, essentially the same climate pattern working in exactly opposite directions, depending on which side of Central America you happen to be standing on. Genevieve becoming the first major hurricane of the entire year in either the Atlantic or the Eastern Pacific is not really a coincidence sitting on top of a quiet Atlantic season. It is close to the expected outcome of the same single atmospheric driver, splitting the world's hurricane basins into one that is unusually calm and one that is unusually active, playing out in real time on the exact same morning. There is a genuinely useful lesson sitting inside how differently these two storms have been handled by the communities in their path, because it is a fairly direct preview of the kind of decisions that matter most once a storm is confirmed to be approaching. Hawaii's own Central Pacific Hurricane Center began issuing detailed, repeated public updates on Fausto days before its closest approach, consistently emphasizing that even a weakening storm carries real hazards through surf and rip currents, rather than allowing the storm's declining wind speed to create a false sense of safety, and explicitly encouraging residents to use the lead time TO review hurricane preparedness plans and stock enough food and water to be self-sufficient for up to 14 days if needed. Mexico, facing a storm that current forecasts say will stay well offshore, has still seen its own National Weather Service flag the very real secondary hazard of life-threatening surf and rip currents along the coast, a hazard that kills people almost every year, specifically because it does not require a direct hurricane landfall to become dangerous. Neither government is treating a storm that is technically not making landfall as a reason to stop communicating with the public. And the key distinction, treating indirect hazards like surf and swells with the same seriousness as a direct hit, is precisely the habit that keeps beach-related deaths from becoming the quiet, overlooked footnote of a hurricane season that otherwise produced no confirmed landfalls at all. It's worth naming plainly why a storm that never touches land still gets this much attention from the agencies tracking it, since that is easy to miss if you are only watching for a landfall headline. Roughly half of all hurricane-related deaths in the United States and its territories over the past several decades have come not from wind or storm surge at a landfall point, but from rip currents generated by storms that, in many cases, never made landfall anywhere near the beach where the death occurred. A storm spinning 600 miles offshore can still send waves and dangerous currents onto a coastline days before its own center arrives, or in Genevieve's case, without its center ever arriving at all. That is precisely why the National Hurricane Center's advisory language for Genevieve spent as much time on surf and rip currents along Mexico's southwestern coast as it did on the storm's own category, 5 wind speeds, and why Hawaii's own Hurricane Center has kept surf and rip currents at the top of its own public messaging about Fausto, even as the storm's wind speeds continue to drop toward tropical storm strength. So what does all of this actually mean for you, wherever you happen to be watching this from? If you live in Hawaii, the practical takeaway is straightforward and time-sensitive. Treat the elevated surf and rip current risk building through Tuesday as the primary hazard from Fausto, regardless of how much the storm's own wind speeds continue to decline, and keep watching updates from the Central Pacific Hurricane Center, rather than assuming a weakening storm number on a map means the danger has already passed. If you live anywhere, along Mexico's southwestern coast or the Baja California Peninsula, the same logic applies to Genevieve, a storm that is forecast to stay offshore but is already producing dangerous beach conditions regardless. And if you live anywhere along the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic seaboard, the accurate picture right now is genuine quiet rather than a storm quietly building unseen, though an unusually calm. July is not a guarantee the rest of a 6-month season stays that way, which is exactly why every one of these forecasting agencies keeps updating their outlooks rather than closing the book on the season this early. The honest, grounded summary is this. Hurricane Genevieve became the Eastern Pacific's first Category 5 storm in 2 years this morning, the result of one of the fastest rates of intensification recorded anywhere on the planet so far this year, while staying on a track that keeps it offshore from Mexico. Hurricane Fausto, weakening as it approaches Hawaii, is still expected to bring dangerous surf and rip currents to the islands through Wednesday even without a direct landfall. Both storms are being fueled by the same developing El Niño event that is simultaneously suppressing the Atlantic hurricane season to well below its historical average, a season that has produced only a single named storm through the end of July and shows no sign of changing course over the coming week, according to this morning's official outlook. One single climate pattern, pushing two entirely different outcomes onto two different oceans on the exact same morning, is not a coincidence worth glossing over. It is close to the cleanest real-world illustration available right now of how one climate signal can produce opposite weather on opposite sides of the same continent. We are going to keep tracking both of these systems as they play out over the coming days, sourced the same way we did today, straight from the National Hurricane Center, the Central Pacific Hurricane Center, and the meteorologists actually explaining the mechanism behind each forecast, not recycled headlines. Subscribe so you do not miss the next update, because both of these storms are still actively evolving as this video goes up. And leave that comment below. Tell me where you are watching from and whether either of these storms is actually affecting your own plans this week. Because behind every one of these forecasts is a family in Honolulu deciding whether to change weekend beach plans, a fisherman off the coast of Manzanillo watching swells build up that have nothing to do with a storm anywhere near his own horizon, a lifeguard on Oahu's east shore who will spend the next 2 days pulling people out of currents most of them never saw coming, and a forecaster in Miami this morning, typing out 7 words, no tropical cyclone formation expected, that represent an entire season's worth of preparation finally paying off, at least for now. 5,000 likes on this one. Let us go. See you in the next one.